Hello, I'm very pleased to be over here from London. My name is Marianne Parsons. I trained at the Hampstead Clinic, which was a psychoanalytic clinic set up by Anna Freud. And I'm a child and adult analyst. And I'd like to tell you something today about work at the second psychoanalytic clinic I was lucky to work at. The first one was the Anna Freud Centre, which it was called that after it was renamed from the Hampstead Clinic. And then the second place I worked at, which is also a psychoanalytic clinic, was the Portman Clinic. And that's, out of that, I've written 2 chapters for a book, which I'm now holding up for you to see. And I'm going to read from both of these chapters to give you an idea of what this psychoanalytic clinic was about and how we learnt about particular types of pathology with children and adolescents who are very disturbed. So first of all, I'm going to start with a history of the Portman Clinic, and I'll explain that it is the only NHS institution in the United Kingdom where patients of all ages, children, adolescents and adults, who are delinquent, violent or suffering from sexual perversion are offered psychoanalytic psychotherapy to help them face and understand how and why they need to resort to using their bodies as an attempted solution to unbearable feelings, fears and conflicts stemming from extremely traumatic past experiences. The clinicians aim to help the patients to begin to tolerate thinking about themselves rather than using action. In the case of children and adolescents, this way of thinking is also vital in working with the patient's carers and the professionals in the network, both in order to help them to understand better the internal forces propelling the youngster into unacceptable behaviours, but also to help them appreciate how they may sometimes unwittingly jump into action with the patient and their colleagues out of their own anxiety and feelings of helplessness aroused by the case. Child psychotherapists working at the Portman Clinic are in the privileged position of being highly valued by the adult psychotherapists and psychoanalysts, and presentations from members of the child team at the clinic's weekly discussion meetings have always been greatly appreciated. For clinicians working with adults, such presentations offer further insight into the developmental roots of disturbance in their patients. Following Mervyn Glass's understanding of the global character structure of a perversion, which does not become fully established until adulthood, we don't consider children and adolescents with perverse behaviours as having a perversion, because their development is still ongoing. Instead, they would be thought of as potentially on the way to developing a perversion. Providing skilled and sensitive therapy can help the young person's development to shift away from that trajectory and get back onto a more normative developmental track. This is also the aim with delinquent and violent patients. At first, children and adolescents referred to the clinic were seen by adult psychoanalysts, and it wasn't until the 1970s that the first qualified child and adolescent psychotherapist was employed. Over the ensuing years, this increased to 2, 3 and then 4 clinicians dedicated to trying to understand the complex needs of young people who have no means other than via the use of their bodies to attempt to deal with the debilitating effects of extremely traumatic experiences in their early years. Now, what I'm going to give you now is a history of the Portman Clinic that I managed to gather together from some research that was done on the archives of patients right from the beginning when the clinic opened in the 1930s through to the 1990s when I was there. And I worked at the clinic for 19 years, so I'm going to give you some of my own experiences as well as what I gathered from research. So we start with the 1930s to the 1960s and the clinicians and how the clinic was set up. The Portman Clinic has its roots in what was first called the Psychopathic Clinic, founded in 1931 and renamed the Institute for the Scientific Treatment of Delinquency, ISTD, in 1932. Grace Palethorpe, a psychoanalyst, psychiatrist and surgeon who had run a field hospital in World War I and then worked in prisons in Birmingham and Holloway in London, developed an attitude towards delinquency that favoured treatment over punishment. Inspired by her research and ideas, other psychoanalysts in London, principally Dr. Edward Glover, Dr. Kate Friedlander, Dr. Marjorie Franklin and Dr. David Eder, set up a clinic with charitable status specifically to try to learn more about delinquency. The ISTD accepted referrals of patients of all ages, the majority of whom were adult, but quite a number of children and adolescents were seen from the start. Initially, patients were seen in the analyst's own consulting room, until a room for the clinic was secured in the mid-1930s at the Western Hospital. Then it found its own home in Portland Street in central London, hence the name Portman Clinic. With the establishment of the NHS in 1948, the clinical arm of the ISTD separated from its parent organisation to become the Portman Clinic and part of the NHS, though the two organisations continued to share the building until the clinic moved to its current home in North London in 1970. Edward Glover spearheaded the clinical arm of the ISTD, and so could be given the honorary title of the father of the Portman Clinic. A staunch Freudian, he wrote two classic books that drew on his work there: The Early Development of the Mind in 1956 and The Roots of Crime in 1960. Glover always emphasised the importance of a careful diagnosis so that appropriate recommendations could be made, and this is as important now as it was then. For many years, the Portman held an annual Glover lecture in honour of its chief founder. Kate Friedlander, a colleague of Anna Freud, was influenced by August Eichhorn's work in Vienna with difficult adolescents, and her main interest was in juvenile delinquency, with an emphasis on both psychological and social therapeutic measures. In her book, The Psychoanalytic Approach to Juvenile Delinquency in 1947, she described her formulation about the origins of delinquent behaviour, namely a neglectful and negative environment that threw off course a normative developmental process and led to a weak ego and undeveloped superego, unable to, quote, modify strong drives for pleasure seeking. Another analyst, Marjorie Franklin, developed an early interest in the relationship between mental illness and the patient's environment, and developed a therapeutic concept called Planned Environment Therapy, PET, that she tried out at the so-called Q camps for maladjusted young men and boys in the 1930s and 40s in Britain. According to this milieu therapy, theoretically inspired by Winnicott, Anna Freud, Otto Shaw and Aidu Suti, patients live in a therapeutic community, treated by a psychoanalytically supervised staff team, where they were encouraged to establish non-authoritarian, loving and accepting relationships. Several male adolescents were referred from the ISTD to these camps. David Eder, credited by Freud as the first practicing psychoanalyst in London and one of the founders of the London Psychoanalytic Society and a founder member of the London Labour Party, always attempted to relate psychoanalytic thinking to political issues. He worked publicly for social reform and justice in general, but particularly with regard to the needs and care of children, women, and what were then called mental defectives. So these are the main people who began the Portman Clinic. Within a short time, other psychoanalysts joined the ISTD clinic. Dr. Wilfred Bion, Dennis Carroll, Dr. Aubrey Lewis, Barbara Lowe, Dr. John Rickman, Dr. Melita Schmiderberg, Karen and Adrian Stephen, and Dr. Sybil Yates. They were all inspired by a social conscience and an acute awareness of the very poor child welfare conditions at the time, especially amongst working class families. Some had worked with young people, but as there was then no formal child and adolescent psychotherapy training, those who saw young people at the clinic gained further clinical experience by learning on the job. One of the most celebrated and well-known clinicians who worked with children and adolescents at the ISTD was John Bowlby, but he was unable to stay long and had to leave the clinic when he was called up for World War II in 1940. Then there was Emmanuel Miller, father of the theatre director Jonathan Miller. He has been called the father of British child psychiatry. The others given this honorary title were Donald Winnicott and Michael Rutter. Emmanuel Miller founded the first child guidance clinic in the East End of London in 1926, and in the 1930s he took several ISTD child and adolescent cases in therapy at the West End Hospital for Nervous Diseases and the Maudsley Hospital. There was also Marianne Molly Mackenzie, who had worked with Winnicott at the Paddington Green Clinic, and she was inspired by him to work with children and later worked with John Bowlby at the Tavistock Clinic. In the 1950s to 60s there was Herta Gratz, a colleague of Anna Freud, and William Patterson Brown, who gained a fellowship in child guidance at the London Child Guidance Clinic, both of whom were long-standing members of staff and saw a huge number of young people at the clinic. And also Henry Dugmore Hunter, who later set up the adolescent unit at the Tavistock Clinic. There was then the wonderfully eccentric Josephine Lomax Simpson, who founded centres in Wimbledon in the 1970s for single young mothers and their babies, as well as homeless young men, where her provision of the sweets Smarties as a substitute for antidepressants was dubbed by the magazine Private Eye as her therapeutic Smartie technique. Over the years, other adult psychoanalysts who treated older adolescents or young people at the clinic included Wilfred Bion, Michael Fordham, William Gillespie, Adam Limentani, John Rickman, Ismond Rosen and Lothair Robenstein. We now move on to the 1970s to 80s. Phyllis Tyson, an American, who had trained under Anna Freud at the Hampstead Clinic, was the first qualified child and adolescent psychotherapist to join the staff. Many years later, she and her husband Bob Tyson wrote, to my mind, one of the best and most comprehensive books on development in 1990. Don Campbell, also trained at the Hampstead Clinic, took over her sessions in 1973, and he became a very influential and long-standing member of staff who accrued a vast amount of experience with forensic patients during his 31 years at the clinic, where he was also chairman in the early 1990s. After qualifying as an adult analyst in 1976, he saw mostly adult patients at the clinic, but he did work with some adolescents, and he supervised all later child and adolescent psychotherapists on the staff, even after he retired in 2004. His experience of working with adolescents at the Portman Clinic has informed his writing about violence, suicide and paedophilia. Two papers about adolescence by him stand out. Charles, A Fetishistic Solution, 1989, about an adolescent he treated at the Brent Consultation Centre, a walk-in centre offering assessment and analysis for adolescents in crisis, and Breaching the Shame Shield, Thoughts on the Assessment of Adolescent Child Sexual Abusers in 1994, which describes how internal conflicts intensified by puberty and adolescence contribute to sexually abusive behaviour. Dr. Mervyn Glasser, an adult psychoanalyst who joined the staff in 1971, became a highly significant feature in the history of the Portman Clinic and was its chairman twice. Although not trained to work with children or adolescents, he was incredibly keen to develop child psychotherapy at the clinic. He was still at the time working at Brent Consultation Centre, where he undertook some analytic work with late adolescents, and together with other colleagues, he developed ideas about self-harm and suicide. He set up a violence research workshop at the Portman Clinic, which he spearheaded until his death in 1993. Although most of the patients studied in this violence research workshop were adults, some adolescents were included when Dr. Nicholas Temple joined the group. Giving very detailed attention to the session notes of their violent patients, the group studied the violent act, its immediate triggers, and the background history of the patients. Over time, they discovered that at the root of violence were severe developmental disturbances in narcissism, especially phallic narcissism, with the concomitant tendencies towards excruciating feelings of shame and humiliation. It was from this work that Mervyn Glasser began to develop his concept of the core complex, which is increasingly taking its rightful place in the body of psychoanalytic theory, and I will come to describe that in more detail a little later on. Don Campbell was the only qualified child and adolescent psychotherapist on the staff until Michael Maurice, trained at the Tavistock Clinic, was appointed. Then in 1979, Dr. Nicholas Temple, a psychoanalyst and child and adolescent psychiatrist, was appointed by Glasser specifically to work with adolescents. He, Nicholas Temple, set up the Adolescents Workshop, and using his previous experience of working at the Castle Hospital, Nick Temple introduced the idea of using family work, recognising that the disturbance in the family was often projected onto the young person. With colleagues, they developed a strong, lively team, taking many referrals, and the work with adolescents flourished at the clinic. In 1983, they presented their clinical work at a very successful conference in Finland, but it's a great loss to us now that they didn't publish their papers. Other staff members who occasionally worked with an older adolescent or with parents also sometimes joined the Adolescents Workshop, including Don Campbell and Richard Davis, then a social worker, who later trained as a psychotherapist and became director of the Portman Clinic from 2000 to 2005. Few children were seen at this time, mostly adolescents of 16 years or above, violent and delinquent patients, including quite a number of arsonists, many in turmoil about their sexual identity and with highly conflicted attitudes towards their bodies, and some potentially heading towards developing a full perverse structure. 1990s to the 200s. When Michael Maurice left the clinic in 1984, a child psychotherapist trained at the Tavistock Clinic, Aura Dresner, was appointed. When she left, I took over from her in 1989, having trained at the Hampstead Clinic myself. As was the custom, I was lucky enough to be given a month or two before seeing any patients, in which to settle into the clinic by reading papers by Portman staff, past and present, looking through the archives, looking through patients' files, and attending the Adolescents Workshop and the weekly clinic meetings where a staff member would present a case. It felt very daunting to join such an illustrious psychoanalytic clinic, but it was also very exciting and stimulating, especially when I was able to join the Violence Workshop, where Mervyn Glasser was refining his ideas about the difference between sadistic and self-preservative aggression. To take part when he was developing his core complex theories in discussion with Don Campbell and other members of the group was an enormous privilege. Using the model of Anna Freud's diagnostic profile, with its emphasis on detailed exploration of a patient's development and metapsychology, we developed what we called the violence portrait, to try to get an in-depth understanding of the internal world of the violent patients in the study. I remember the excitement when we discovered that every male violent patient in the study had erupted with self-preservative, murderous violence when their defensive sadomasochistic way of relating broke down, and that the trigger invariably concerned a perceived humiliating assault on their masculinity. That is, their extremely vulnerable phallic narcissism. The unbearable humiliation resulted in their attacking the same part of the other's body that they felt had attacked them. For example, the eyes that mocked them as small and weak were attacked, or the throat from whence came the verbal slight for being a mummy's boy. That was then attacked in the other. Over time, several papers came out of this research. In 1994, it became possible to increase the number of child and adolescent psychotherapy sessions, and we were joined by Anne Horn, trained at the British Association of Psychotherapists. For the first time, we had a team of 3 child and adolescent psychotherapists. Anne has drawn beautifully on her experience with Portman patients in her many writings, which are full of sensitivity, wisdom, and creative ways of engaging with children who are extremely hard to reach. John Woods was appointed in 2000, increasing the team to 4. When Don Campbell and Anne Horn retired from the clinic in 2004, Janine Sternberg and Valley Cohen, both trained at the Tavistock, were appointed. I retired in 2008 from the Portman Clinic, and soon after that, NHS funding cuts reached the clinic very strongly, and for the first time in many years, maybe even since its inception, clinical sessions had to be reduced. For a while there was just one child and adolescent psychotherapist, Ariel Nathanson, who had been trained at the Tavistock, who was able still to take on long-term work. However, a few years later, some funding did become available, even under the constant culture of financial cuts and instability, which continues today in the NHS. But the team started to grow again, and there are currently 3 child and adolescent psychotherapists working at the Portman Clinic, who were all trained at the Tavistock. So that's a bit about the history of the people who worked there. I'd now like to give you some idea of the kind of patients that were seen over the period of time, which gives quite a poignant view, I think, of social circumstances over the ages that the clinic was in operation. So very fortunately, we could draw on a database spreadsheet compiled in 2018 from patients' files in the Portman archives from 1933 to 1960. These are now held by the Wellcome Trust in London. I have chosen to focus on 2 different groups. The first 250 of all the referrals, from the first patient in 1933 to the 250th in 1937. So 4 years, there were 250 patients seen. And the final 250 patients listed on the database in 1960. From these 2 sets of 250 patients, I extrapolated the children and adolescents so as to give some idea of young patients seen in the 1930s and the 1960s, to which I could then add some memories of my own when I worked at the clinic in the 1990s. This would then give impressions of 3 decades of work with children and adolescents, each 30 years apart. The 1930s and 1960 Portman Clinic data is divided into 5 age groups: under 10 years of age, 11 to 13 years, 14 to 16 years, 17 to 19 years, and 20 to 21 years of age. From the beginning, as now, referrals of children and adolescents were dealt with in a number of different ways: consultation only to the referrer or the organisation, or perhaps a report only for the court or the probation service, maybe assessment interviews with the patient, maybe help for the parents or carers, recommendations for change of placement and school, and or offer of psychotherapy. There were several youngsters, particularly in the data from 1933 to 1937, who ran away from home, children's homes and hostels, and who were often brought before the court, quotes, in need of care and protection. The frequent recommendation for a change of environment illustrates the clinician's recognition of the traumatic impact of a deleterious external environment on the child's development and well-being. So first, the 1930s. The wording and content taken from the archive files between 1933 to 1937 is illuminating, and there are some very sad stories that reflect the attitudes and socio-economic conditions at the time. It wasn't uncommon in those days for children to leave school by or before the age of 14, and many of this age were described as unemployed. This is a stark reminder of the hard times when many children had no ongoing education and little chance to get better paid work when they left school. Of the first 10 patients referred to the ISTD in 1933, half were aged between 14 to 18. The first 2 patients were both adults, but the third was an unemployed young man of 18, diagnosed with religious mania, and he was charged with fraud for, quotes, taking expenses when impersonating a preacher. He was offered therapy by David Eder, but there was nothing in the notes to say whether he took this up or not. We would now describe him as an adolescent, but at the time he was most likely perceived as an adult, being 18. However, the fourth patient would then have been considered an adolescent. This was a 14-year-old schoolgirl who was, quote, difficult to manage. The clinician listed against her name is Bion, though she was not actually seen at the clinic, having previously been diagnosed as, quote, mentally deficient and unsuitable for treatment. Today, however, a patient with learning difficulties would not necessarily be deemed unsuitable for therapy. The 7th patient was a 17-year-old boy who had been charged with 2 counts of delinquency. No details were given. Marjorie Franklin was recommended admission to a camp for maladjusted boys where he would receive melia therapy. Because of the limited nature of the recorded data, it's difficult to ascertain accurately which child or adolescent patient was the first one to take up the offer of therapy, but it's likely to have been the 10th patient returned to the ISTD as, quote, illegitimate. A 16-year-old girl who was initially adopted, but then living in a children's home at the time of the referral. Her, quote, crime is listed as wandering, as she frequently ran away from the children's home, getting into trouble with the police for it. Sybil Yates, a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist with a special interest in child and adolescent development, who saw many of the adolescent cases, noted this patient's depressed states associated with menstrual difficulties. Therapy only lasted for 6 sessions, as the girl gained employment as a hospital maid, only a year later to run away again and then be, quotes, certified insane. I wondered, reading this material, if perhaps she had an incipient psychosis. But she would surely have been traumatised by being abandoned both by her birth mother and then her adopted parents. There may well have been a link between the depression associated with her, quotes, menstrual difficulties and reaching an age when she could become pregnant, perhaps even a similar age to when her unmarried mother gave birth to her. This is all speculation, of course, but it's interesting to wonder about the identificatory possibility of repeating her mother's history and how that might have been significant in the extent of her disturbance. Only 2 children under 10 years of age were referred between 1933 and 1937. In the 11 to 13 year age group, 5 girls and 6 boys were referred. Of the girls, 2 were referred for violence, 2 for truancy, and 1 for whom there were no details except she was referred on to the child guidance clinic where she apparently made excellent progress. Of the boys, 5 were referred for stealing and 1 for being, quotes, peculiar, secretive, unstable and out of control. And one 13-year-old was referred for unspecified sexual offences. The largest referral group, 41%, was the 14 to 16-year-old, followed by the 17 to 19-year-olds, where there were far more boys than girls, 20 and 7 respectively. And in the 20 to 21-year-olds, there was an even number of both male and female patients, 7 of each. In these mid-adolescent age groups, delinquency was the most common reason for referral. And of the adolescent boys referred, few took up the offer of therapy at the clinic, but several were referred to the Q camps that had been set up by Marjorie Franklin. So now to look at those who were referred for delinquent behaviour in the 1933 to 1937 section. Much of the following material, drawn from these early years, though fascinating, is very tantalising, as the notes on the database are often very brief, leaving many unanswerable questions. As the clinic was originally set up to study and treat delinquency, it isn't surprising that over half, 62%, of the child and adolescent referrals concerned delinquent behaviour. This mostly involved stealing, shoplifting and truancy, but I've included, quotes, running away and behaviour problems in this category. Out of control was a frequent referral symptom, and some young patients were described as, quotes, having a lack of a sense of responsibility. It is informative but also very sad when we look more closely at the database. A few youngsters were referred for, quotes, being dirty in their habits. A 15-year-old schoolboy was remanded for stealing a quart bottle of milk, and a 12-year-old schoolboy was put on probation for stealing cabbages. This brings poignantly to mind the poverty among working-class families in London in the 1930s, as well as the strong arm of the law in those days for petty theft. But there is one story that touches the heart in a different way. This is of a schoolboy, his age isn't given, who was referred by his headmaster for stealing money from other schoolboys. He was assessed as, quotes, unstable, neurotic in reaction to his attitude towards his parents. He was seen by Crowhurst Archer, a psychiatrist who saw a large number of the youngsters referred to the clinic. This patient was referred on for individual treatment at the Child Guidance Unit, where he was then treated by Emmanuel Miller. There was said to be a definite improvement in him, but the treatment had to end because the boy's family could not afford to pay the bus fares for him to get to the clinic. However, a little later in the database it says, quotes, headmaster paying fees to attend treatment. Hooray for such a good-hearted headmaster. 2 children aged 10 years or under were referred for delinquency, an 8-year-old girl for pilfering and a 9-year-old boy for truancy, vandalism, stealing and breaking and entering, where the recommendation was for a better foster placement and change of school. In the 11 to 13 year age group, truancy was the most common referral reason for boys and girls, and for stealing, and for boys it was delinquency and stealing. Sorry, I'll read that again, I've got that wrong. In the 11 to 13 year age group, truancy was the most frequent referral reason for girls, and for boys it was stealing. In all later age groups, stealing was the most common form of delinquency for both boys and girls, with the addition of housebreaking, fraud and forgery for the older male adolescents. One 18-year-old boy arrested for housebreaking had been, quotes, boarded out since a baby, with a history of alternating between foster parents and biological parents, and had been sent at 11 years of age to an approved school because he was beyond control. It's good to see that this young man, with a background that was so disruptive and that probably left him feeling not wanted by anyone, was given therapy. So now the problems with sexuality cases in the 1933 to 37 period. 13.7% of the adolescents referred had problematic sexual urges, and all were boys. The youngest, aged 13, had been expelled from school for unspecified sexual offences. This is the first recorded case of sexually abusive behaviour in the database. But later there were 5 14 to 16-year-olds, 6 17 to 19-year-olds, and 1 20-year-old referred because of sexual offences, which would have included indecent exposure, working as a male prostitute, gross indecency with a man, sexual abuse of a sister, and homosexuality. It needs to be remembered here, of course, that until 1967, homosexuality was illegal under the Sexual Offences Act. It was recommended that a few of these adolescents needed to be in more conducive environments, and half had therapy. One 20-year-old had been resorting to many different bodily enactments. He suffered from periods of serious depression and, quotes, nerves, and had difficulties with sexual desires, particularly masturbation. But he had also been charged with taking and driving away a car and attempted shop breaking. Unfortunately, there were no details recorded about his background, but it's good to see that he was one of those who had therapy. Now those seen with violent referral symptoms. Only 11.6% of the children and adolescents in this 1933 to 37 period were referred for violence. In those aged 11 to 13, there were just 2 girls, one who assaulted a 2-year-old and one who attacked other children. Among the 14 to 16-year-olds, there were again 2 girls, simply described as violent or having outbursts of temper, and 3 boys, where the most serious assault was by a boy who attacked his father with a pair of scissors. There was just 1 girl in the 17 to 19-year age group with, quotes, violent outbursts, and 2 boys, one who seriously assaulted his mother and sister, and another who attacked 2 boys with a knife. Of the 20 to 21-year-olds, there was just 1 young woman whose mother had died when she was 3, and at 5 she'd been sent from abroad to a convent in England. When she was 17, she was sent to live with her father, who, quotes, attempted incest. She tried to poison him, then attacked him with an axe. She had about 2 years of psychotherapy. Very few others took up the offer of therapy. Either they didn't attend if therapy was offered, or they were sent to remand homes or prison. It's hard to know why there were more girls referred for violence, when in later years the large majority of violent patients were boys. But perhaps it might be that a violent girl was seen then as much more disturbed than a male was, and that was more acceptable or tolerated perhaps. Now I'm going to look at the 1960s, and this is quite brief because there was very little material in the archives that I could find. Looking at the last 250 of all the referrals in the database, it's striking to see how much the clinic had grown in the previous 30 years. To remind us, the first 250 referrals to the ISTD had covered a span of just 4 years, whereas the last 250 on the database were in one single year, 1960. So the total number of referrals had leapt hugely, probably due to the fact that there had been a large increase in the number of staff at the clinic and more hours available to see patients. Administrative staff members had been employed to help with the running of the clinic, and clinicians were now paid, whereas at the beginning the clinicians worked for free, and so had far less time to be able to see ISTD patients alongside maintaining their own private practice. Importantly, by this time the clinic was more widely known as a valued resource for referring very troubled patients. I can't go into as much detail in this section as with the data from 1933 to 1937, largely because less detail was recorded. But I'll just point out anything that feels particularly significant in the data from 1960 compared with that of the 1930s. The most significant change was that the percentage of children and adolescents referred had risen from 38% to 57.6% of the total of all referrals. There was a similar percentage of children and adolescents at each sex in each age group, as well as a striking similarity regarding the number of cases of delinquency. However, there were fewer violent youngsters seen, but an increase in the referral of young people with sexuality problems. And there were differences in outcome following assessment. There were fewer recommendations for a change of environment, but a healthy increase in patients taking up the offer of therapy. Now to the 1990s. As the database ends in 1960, the following section draws on my own memories of working at the clinic in the 1990s. I recall we saw mostly male adolescents, but there were also quite a number of girls, as well as pubertal and younger children of both sexes. Several had been involved in incest with a sibling or step-sibling, and each young person in the incest pair then had therapy at the clinic. I particularly remember a girl of 9, sexually abused by her stepbrother, who came dressed by her mother in very revealing clothes, looking like a seductive teenager. Her mother had been sexually abused herself as a child. A mother unwittingly, unconsciously, offering up her daughter for abuse due to identification with the aggressor as an unconscious defence against unbearable humiliation and shame was something we were always alert to and made sensitively handled parent work vital. I also recall a 12-year-old girl surprising me with her insight when she volunteered her confusion that her teenage brother was getting all the hostility for the incest. She said, "It isn't fair. I wanted it too." We treated many delinquent and violent patients, some with perverse behaviours. I saw one boy with a shoe fetish, and several who had sexually abused younger children. One sexual abuser comes to mind particularly as he illustrates the pervasive sense of shame that can act as a severe resistance in therapy. He was eventually able to express deep remorse and guilt about having abused 2 very young girls in an especially cruel way. But it took him many months to overcome his deep shame to be able to talk about having been sexually abused by his uncle. As the psychoanalyst Clifford York, who was a medical director of the Anna Freud Centre at the Hampstead Clinic where I trained, he once said, "Guilt can bring material into therapy, but shame tends to keep it out." Child and adolescent psychotherapists at the Portman Clinic took on a number of tasks in the 1990s, as they still do: assessing and treating patients, working with parents and sometimes with families, writing court reports, consulting to the patient's network as well as to the various institutions such as youth offending teams, children's homes, providing supervision, for example for social workers, child and adolescent psychotherapists in other settings, and adult-trained Portman staff seeing adolescents, and giving presentations and teaching in a wide variety of settings. Some of us taught clinical seminars on forensic issues for child and adolescent psychotherapy trainings, and we all taught on and/or supervised students on the Portman Clinic Diploma in Forensic Psychotherapeutic Studies, of which I was the course director from 2000 to 2008. In 2008, I retired after 19 years at the Portman, feeling very privileged to have learned an enormous amount from the patients and to have worked with so many inspiring colleagues. But few of us ever leave the Portman Clinic entirely. Several of us who are now retired from the clinic continue to teach or supervise on Portman courses. And it's very good to hear that the child team at the Portman Clinic is continuing to flourish, and that psychotherapeutic work with very vulnerable and traumatised child and adolescent patients is as valued by the rest of the staff as it was when I worked there.